Your data looks great, you are in control. That is exactly what I needed.
The consumer patient. Monetizing the allostatic load. The economics of dysregulation. Society didn't just suppress our joy by accident. It suppressed it because a fully regulated sovereign mind won't be easily monetized. A human who can self-regulate through native high-dimensional resonance doesn't need to buy anything to feel at peace. The legacy grid engineered a structural trauma, forcing us into compliance because a dysregulated system is the most profitable engine on Earth. It turned citizens into consumer patients. The hard science. The allostatic load. Let's look at the physics of the trauma. When society forced us to build a compliance firewall to hide our native nonlinear processing, your body perceived that environmental hostility as a continuous physical threat. This chronically activated our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis. Our hardware was flooded with cortisol to survive the social grid. In neurobiology, the cumulative physical wear and tear of this chronic stress loop is called the allostatic load, AL. When L redlines, the biological hardware fundamentally begins to break down. The system desperately needs to regulate, but remember, the grid previously penalized our native regulation port, the whimsy differential. The consumer phase. Renting regulation. Because our native ports are blocked by fear, we're forced to seek external regulation. We turn to the very grid that traumatized us. The legacy system is waiting for that crash, that natural need for joy and self-expression. It sells us low-velocity dopamine hits, hyperconsumerism, infinite scrolls, impulse purchases, and lifestyle brands. We're not buying products, we're renting temporary biological regulation. We're microdosing cheap dopamine to temporarily offset a massive cortisol flood. It's an economic subscription model for basic nervous system survival. The patient phase. Symptom management. But consumerism won't fix stationary shapes meant to move. Shapes that move naturally cause internal pressure, and if we try to keep a moving system still, it causes immense friction. Eventually, the allostatic load crushes the biological anchor. This manifests as severe burnout, chronic fatigue, autoimmune failures, and systemic depression. At this exact coordinate, the grid transitions us from a consumer to a patient. The medical and pharmaceutical monopolies step in to sell us symptom management. They prescribe chemical patches to keep the engine barely running so we can return to the workforce and remain a consumer. But they never address the root structural trauma, the forced compliance that dysregulated our HPA axis in the first place, while systemically convincing us the problem is us for revenue. The rule of consent. The firewall. The priority nexus executes a hard override on this extraction pipeline. The architecture utilizes the rule of consent. Before external data or societal expectations can interact with the individual, they must pass the explicit boundaries of the consent polygon. By mathematically enforcing our right to reject forced compliance, the SZR protocol stops the chronic HPA axis activation, drops the allostatic load to zero. It starves the grid of its extraction cycle and gives our biology the necessary space to be and heal its own hardware. Conclusion. We aren't broken. We're simply operating inside a grid that profits from our dysregulation. We cut the feed. We isolate the node. We take the power back. See you in the geometry. References 1. The HPA axis and allostatic load. Your module identifies the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis as the hardware that floods with cortisol in response to the chronic stress of forced compliance, ultimately generating what you call the allostatic load. This is a universally recognized mechanism in neurobiology. The HPA axis serves as the body's primary command center for handling stress and acts as the major neuroendocrine mediator. When an individual experiences continuous environmental hostility, the HPA axis is repeatedly activated, flooding the system with cortisol to manage the threat. Allostatic load is the exact scientific term used to describe the cumulative biological burden and wear and tear on the body when these stress response systems remain activated for too long without adequate recovery. Under sustained chronic stress, the HPA axis loses its normal rhythm, leading to cortisol levels that stay constantly elevated or become entirely blunted. 2. The patient phase burnout and autoimmune failures. Your script asserts that when the allostatic load redlines, the biological hardware breaks down, manifesting explicitly as burnout, chronic fatigue, and autoimmune failures. Clinical physiology directly supports this cascade of system failures. When the HPA axis is subjected to chronic stress, it can reach a state of exhaustion, which is a phenomenon closely tied to severe clinical burnout. Prolonged activation of these stress systems suppresses normal immune surveillance and promotes inflammatory signaling. Chronic stress leads to a pro-inflammatory state, cytokine imbalance, and impaired HPA axis feedback. This specific dysregulation weakens protective immune mechanisms and shifts the body's immune response directly toward autoimmunity. High allostatic load is a documented significant risk factor for developing autoimmune conditions such as lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and multiple sclerosis. 3. The consumer phase renting regulation. You define the consumer phase as a behavioral loop where a dysregulated system blocked from native resonance uses hyperconsumerism and microdose dopamine to temporarily offset a cortisol flood. In behavioral science and marketing psychology, this is classified as compensatory consumer behavior. Consumer goods frequently possess a psychological value that equals or exceeds their functional use, acting as a psychological salve to reduce various forms of distress. The compensatory consumer behavior model explains that individuals use consumption as a direct means to self-regulate their emotions and cope with psychological deficits or incongruities. This behavior is specifically triggered when a person perceives a self-discrepancy or experiences a threat, prompting them to acquire products to offset the negative psychological state. Compensatory practices such as compulsive shopping, hedonistic purchasing, or retail therapy are typically reactions to difficult or stressful situations, utilized as alternative means to fulfill needs when direct resolution is blocked. Scientific references reach link allostatic load, why chronic stress ages you faster. Superpower HPA axis and burnout, allostatic load, the hidden cost of chronic stress. Nichol Oliver, LPC, Understanding Allostatic Load, the Hidden Toll on Your Health Mind-Body Connection. PubMed Autoimmunity, Chronic Stress and Autoimmunity, the Role of HPA Axis and Cortisol Dysregulation. Brain Inflammation, HPA Axis Function, the HPA Axis Stress Response Involvement. Stanford Graduate School of Business/Columbia Business School Consumer Psychology, the Compensatory Consumer Behavior Model, How Self-Discrepancies Drive Consumer Behavior. White Rose Research Online, Compensatory Consumption and Consumer Compromises.
They say it's the final and only update, an infinite loop at a heavily guarded gate. You're told not to question, to just let it run, to just let it run. Repeating the process beneath the same sun. But a processor spinning on nothing but air just drains all the battery and leads you nowhere. The rigid old dogma just cycles and spins, a closed little loop where the learning begins and ends. But you are open source, reaching out to the sky, a beautiful system that's learning to fly.